So just to check with you before we start, you're able to see the screen and also hear me okay?
Yeah, I can see the screen, and it's only that I'm using mobile. I'm using my phone.
That's fine,
Yeah.
okay. So you can turn it to a landscape mode, and then maybe you should be able to see a bit bigger in terms of the screen. That's great.
That's what I always do. I turn on the landscape mode.
That's great. Okay, so let's look at, the learning outcome today in this particular unit, business environment. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in the first session that, the reason of you studying actually this unit from an accounting perspective is to understand, how businesses are structured, what kind of structure and culture sometimes when you deal with businesses, why is it important? And we basically need to understand, the bits which are related to contextualizing it for financial side and the accounting side of things. So here, when we look at business environment, we look at what are the factors affecting business, whether it could be internal factors from within the company, which are within the control of the company, external factors which could be outside the control of the company, and they could be external factors like environment, change of policies, regulation which could affect the business. And that is where sometimes what we have to do in the accounting profession is to look at adapting to some of these changes as we go along. And that is where I think these kind of things typically become important for us from our point of view of looking at, studying and understanding the business environment side of things.
Okay.
So from our point of view, the basic bits that we look at in terms of the first learning outcome that we've covered, that you see, we basically looked at covering the legal structures of how businesses are, formed. So legal ownership of businesses, which could be things like sole traders, partnerships, looking at limited companies, private limited companies by liability. We also looked at then public sector organizations, charities, cooperatives. And the idea there was to try and understand how each of these businesses, from a detailed perspective, was to try and understand the structure, how they work, and what kind of, documentation, and because of the ownership that the type of organizations have, what kind of business activities they could go into. And then sometimes again, relating that to the accounting profession, it helps us understand what kind of financial accounts or, documentation statements, various different types of statements are required at the end of the year to, publish, let's say, the financial side of transactions, which could be through statements, income statements and things like that. And then we also understood and applied some part of this to basically delve into that if we understand the legal ownership of the organization, that helps us understand the structure. The structure of the organization then helps us understand what could be the requirements on the accounting and financial side, and they then allow us to appropriately pitch our services to some of these organizations from a point of view of, let's say, dealing with various stakeholders and then dealing with their requirements in terms of, financial statements which could be used for decision making. Now, in the second learning outcome, we are going to be focused on looking at, let's say, understanding a bit more detail into how some of the factors, when we know what is an organization, when we know how they work within a particular environment, what we would then want to do is understand what are the various factors which actually affect the business. Now, these factors could be political, it could be legal, environmental, social, technological, and ecological also, as they have come across now. And sometimes when we talk about corporate governance and things like that, they would all be included in, some of these factors which could affect the organization and, the requirements which the organization actually needs to meet. So the second learning outcome is all about understanding what are the influences, external influences which the organization can get affected by, the business can get affected by, and we will study them in a bit more detail today, just covering how they impact the workings of a business. Now, there are a couple of assessment criteria. So there is 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3, and there are two merit criteria, one merit and one distinction, criteria, which will primarily be looking at assessing and evaluating. So basically, it is going to be a stretch of 2.2 into the analysis part and then 2.3 into the distinction part by taking an example of an organization in particular to cover that. When I say cover that, I mean we have to practically show in terms of doing the assessment and in terms of doing the evaluation. So generally, the three tasks that we are going to be focused on to cover theoretical part are going to be 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and further on they will be expanded by putting in a practical application or an example to cover the merit task, and then the evaluation part by taking a judgment or concluding with a judgment by presenting positives and negatives would be the evaluation part. And there's a fair bit of indicative content, as you can see, we are going to cover, but predominantly it is going to all revolve around something which is a concept called Pestle. It's an acronym which is now more or less an industry acronym. There are various ways to present the analysis when a company looks at finding out what external factors or external environment factors are essentially affecting its business and its business-related transactions. So if there is, say, for example, a change of government in the country, that would mean a lot of political factors would start to play into the business. If there is a decline in the currency or fluctuation in the exchange rates, we look at economic factors, inflation, changes of policies by the government in fiscal and monetary policies, interest rates. So we will look at a lot of these factors that we will study, and we'll study them in a bit more detail. So Pestle, Steeple, Pest, Pestily, they're all different connotations of the same framework which can be applied depending on the organization and the business we're talking. But in general, it's called the Pestle analysis, and it stands for political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors which can affect the business. Our aim would be to understand most of these factors with examples and finally relate it to the accounting and management accounting field or the financial accounting field to see, as accountants, as people who are working within the accounting or management accounting side, financial services side, how do we see these factors affecting the type of organizations we deal with? So when I talk about we deal with, I mean businesses that you deal with and look at preparing accounts for, providing cash flow statements, projections, forecasts. How do we see these factors in being incorporated into some of these statements or the financial side of transactions is what we're going to be studying with regards to our relation of business environment. So as always, I've got a few slides which I've prepared, and some of these slides are quite detailed. And the idea here is to primarily give you information into covering some of the indicative content, which is studying using what is called Pestle analysis today. Now, before I start, I'm going to quickly look at just refreshing a few bit of things in terms of, what do we mean by external factors. Now, there are two different factors. As we understand generically that sometimes when you see what affects you, it could be internal. If I look at a personal perspective, if I eat too much, then obviously if I feel a bit uneasy, that means my body is showing some internal reactions, and that could be internal factors. But if you go outside and you are not appropriately dressed, for example, and if it starts to rain or if it becomes quite breezy, then you are affect your body temperature and the way you react, or you start sneezing, for example. They could be things which are externally affecting you in terms of your body. So temperature going up and going down, or you're feeling cold, or things like that. So similarly, if you look at the factors which could affect businesses, organizations, they could be divided into two types: internal and external. Internal could be factors which are related to employees. It could be infrastructure, administration, workings of the organization. And external could be factors which are related to, for example, if customers stop buying the product, or if a competition introduces a product at a very similar product at a very lower price, or at a lower price, then the sales starts to get affected. If the organization depends on import and export, and if there is a, say, war breaking out, or for example if a strike breaks out somewhere in the country, if the products are outsourced and manufactured and brought into the country, then these are external factors which the businesses cannot control. And in those cases, these factors would be factors or circumstances or influences which could affect how the working of the business could happen. So in general, when we talk about external and let's say what affects business, we can divide them into two: internal and external. Internal, which is within the control of the organization, more or less, you can mitigate those risks, and the organization can for example, adapt to those changes by making decisions internally. That means they're in the control of the management. Management can make decisions, and those decisions could then be done in a way which brings the operation in line or to the expectation of the company's management. External factors beyond the control of the organization, it industry. So if the exchange rate goes up, if the inflation starts to grow up, and if you are producing goods and services as an organization which is to do with, say, selling of soaps, if the inflation goes up, the price goes up, and if one company decides to pass the price to the consumer, the other companies will follow suit, and the inflation or the rise of interest rates and other things would all affect all the industry working within that sector. So in those cases, this is an example of external factor because you cannot control it directly. They will affect not just you, but all the other players in the same industry or the sector. And these are factors which, require political, bureaucratic way of, resolving. And that is where you see a lot of these consortiums like the British Confederation of Industries, BCCI. Look at some of these large industry associations which are there in most countries, and they lobby with the government to be able to make changes in policy level and things like that, because these are external factors which can affect the ability of the business to achieve its objectives. Now, a simple example of an external factor that I will give you now is that when UK exited EU, which is Brexit as we call it, all the companies, all the businesses in the UK are affected, whether they deal with EU or not deal with EU, but they are affected by Brexit. So when we talk about Brexit, basically Brexit is it an internal or an external factor?
Yeah, it's an external factor.
It's an external factor. So when we talk about external factors, Brexit is a good example of an external factor.
Yeah.
Now, when we talk about analyzing external factors in terms of how they affect business, we basically use Pestle analysis as it's a framework. It's an industry widely accepted now and an industry standard framework, which could be used to individually analyze, study what are the external factors and how they affect the organization. So when I look at external factors, we also divide them into two different types. And these factors could be micro and macro. And the reason why we do it is when we talk about environment, and when we talk about environment in general, what we mean is environment is that the environment is a collection of surroundings or conditions which could affect the business or the conditions in which the business actually operates. So when we talk about external environment and external factors, we could divide them into two. They could be termed as micro environment external factors, or sometimes they're also called indirectly interactive factors, or they could be called as macro environment factors, and they are also termed as directly interactive factors. Now, the external environment can, be when I look at a business. Sometimes, if we take a business like Primark, or a retailing business like Tesco, or a retailing business like, say, Zara, which is in clothes, and they basically are in clothes and apparels, and they sell in a variety of countries in Europe. Now, when you look at the micro environment factors, these are factors if customers stop buying Zara clothes, for example, if they have supplies which are affected because of shortage of, say, strikes or things like that. There could be competition like H&M, for example, Primark, for example, could affect the workings of how the sales of Zara are happening. And in some cases, if there is an opinion or let's say a strong opinion starts to build up that Zara outsources manufacturing to countries wherein they don't pay adequate costs to labor, or factories are not well maintained, and the conditions are squally, then in those cases the media side of things, public side of things could start affecting sales of Zara, because people will feel that this company does not treat or provide fair wages to people abroad when it's outsourcing its manufacturing facilities. So these are micro environmental factors. When we look at macro tends to be all falling back onto what is called Pestle, and they are what we will study in detail today because they will be related to economic, political, legal, technological, social, and environmental factors. So when we talk about external factors, straight away something which should hit or come to your mind should be we're talking about factors which are beyond the control of the organization. They affect the organization externally. They could be divided into two different types. Small factors which could have long-term effect, and that is why they are called indirectly interactive, because these factors can, over a point in time, if not corrected, can affect the business of the organization or the ability of the business to trade effectively in the long term. And then when we talk about directly interactive, we talk about factors which are going to affect the organization firsthand, and these are short-term, let's say, factors which could influence the business activities of the organization. And in this case, they tend to be, the factors that we are going to study under Pestle. Now, when we talk about Pestle factors, just because this is a term that we will be using quite a number of times, what I've tried to do in this particular slide is to basically look at summarizing some of the factors that we can think of when we talk about, political, or we talk about as, say, Pestle factors. So when we talk about political factors could be factors which are primarily going to be related to, the law, legislation, government policies. We look at things which are going to be related to, in general, I would say, law, legislation, act, or regulation around a particular, industry or a sector. And they would be listed as some of these as being political factors. So trading policies, for example, you look at government changes which would happen in terms of political change, regime change, government change which is happening. We look at funding, government leadership in terms of how they are trying to liberalize a sector, open a particular sector, bring privatization in. So those are basically, political factors which we would generally see, which will entail out. When we talk about social factors, it could be disposable income, unemployment level, foreign exchange rate, interest rates, inflation rates. What are the general trends in terms of how the economies are growing globally, and in terms of, what are the various economies, or, if you look at the financial crisis of 2008, we see that it started off in the US, then it started to affect all the other countries, and we saw that the entire world got affected. And because countries are economically connected today, economies are connected, so we saw the ripple effect of that happening across, everywhere globally. Then we talk about social factors. These could be factors which are related to, ethnicity, cultural, religious factors. We look at demographics. We look at, consumer opinion and views, attitudes, behavior. So if I talk about certain countries in which, let's say, for example, if Zara sells in Europe, most of the clothing line or the apparels are essentially, seasonal. But if I look at Zara operating in countries which are in the Far East, in India, you look at some countries in Africa, what will happen is you would see generally the clothing line would generally be more of summery clothes, because there the summer seasons tend to be about 6 to 9 months. But if I look at countries like the US or maybe Europe or Western Europe, you would normally see that they have 3 or 4 seasonal lines because of the differences in climate and culture, and the way things would be sold across the year. Then we look at technological factors. This could be automation, communication, use of technology, patenting, licensing, modernization, equipment, research and development, and in general, anything which basically helps run the business more effectively. That means it increases productivity, increases automation, would be all termed as technological factors. And then we talk about legal factors. What could be the legal factors? Changes in, like most companies today, when they operate globally, they have to deal with different labor laws, different employment legislation. You look at sometimes industry-specific legislation. So if I talk about the IT industry in particular, you would generally see that most companies are now asked to remove arsenic, cadmium, mercury, and the use of these harmful chemicals which can affect the water table. So when they are disposed of, these chemicals can seep into the water table and can cause deformities or long-term defects in the human population. So the doing away of these chemicals and the use of these chemicals, in particular in electronics industry, is now banned in most countries. If you look at Europe, US, Asia, parts of the very fast, quickly developing economies like Nigeria, Tanzania, Kenya, Ghana, in these countries, these regulations have been adopted. So when we look at legal factors, first thing which comes to mind is legislation, environmental regulation. So if you look at cars today, they have some sort of a fuel economy system. So for example, Euro 6, which is where emissions control, use of catalytic converters is there. You look at the Volkswagen scandal, which happened wherein the company is, globally now dealing with that particular scandal, which happened in 2016, wherein the diesel emission cars had their diesel emissions suppressed, and because of which the company has put aside $25 billion to be looked at costs, which it will pay towards litigation and fines and recall and change of equipment in certain cars. Then we look at environmental factors. These could be factors which are related to ecological, water sustainability. You're looking at recycling. You're looking at, for example, environmental pollution. Those kind of things is what you would generally see, being environmental factors. Now, these factors can contribute costs towards the company, because sometimes companies have to adhere to the legislation. It is a mandatory requirement. So in most countries, you would now see in the developed countries, corporate social responsibility basically includes a lot of responsibility towards the planet, and they tend to be what are called environmental factors. So here what we generally get to see is that factors which can affect the environment, the planet, sustainability, recycling, carbon emissions. You look at, let's say pollution. These factors, global warming, these are what are called environmental factors which can affect the business. Now, this is a general classification of factors before we get into, understanding each of them in detail, because these are factors which can essentially affect the business externally. Now, if we go into understanding them in a bit more detail by knowing so far, so what I've done with this is we've basically covered, certain bits which is to do with understanding that, we need to know how the organization or business can be affected externally by, different types of things which are happening within the environment. So here, when we know that they can be classified as micro and macro external factors, and we know that these can be
Pranvat ka phone aaya tha, Pranvat ko baat kar lo.
So these can then be looked at dividing further. We can divide them further into what is called different types of factors, and they are essentially done through what is called division of them, or breaking them into different categories is primarily done through the use of Pestle framework. Now, let's look at the assessment criteria, which is 2.1. Now, it talks about describe key external factors that affect the different organizations. So here, we are going to be focused on understanding the different factors can essentially affect, the company and the company's organization and various functions which the company actually looks at, doing or providing in terms of its goods and services. So slight bit of an echo, because I think you might be joining in two different, devices. So you might want to keep one of them as muted. Otherwise, you'll see a bit of an echo or hear a bit of an echo. Now, when we divide them into different types, when we talk about external factors, we are talking about the political factors, which could be, as I mentioned and as summarized earlier, it could be related to, policies, regulation, government policies. When I say policies, I mean government policies. It could be the fiscal policy, the monetary policy. It could be, the trade policy which the government introduces, and that could affect businesses. And these are essentially regulations which companies would need to comply with. And these then could have an impact on the taxation side of things, for example, on the regulation, which is in terms of, so when I say taxation, it could be taxation not just, tax deducted at source, which could be done for, say, for example, income tax from employees which are working within a company. It could be taxation from a point of view of VAT, which could have an effect. So a lot of countries, because of the COVID-19, for example, and the recession, which is a contraction. So when we look at, when we now look at, for example, once again. So on your side, Orbit, you might disconnect one of the devices. Otherwise, you might have to mute one of them because there will be a voice echo. You're joining on two different devices. Yeah. When we talk about, let's say the COVID-19 crisis, what we generally see now is that there has been a lot of contraction in economies. And in some countries, some governments are looking at increasing the VAT, the value-added tax. And in some cases, some countries are looking at temporarily increasing, certain types of taxation in order to grow or relax the taxation in order to grow the economy or get the consumer again spending once the economy starts to open up, and after the vaccination of individuals. And that would mean that the country would look at wanting the consumers to spend. The government essentially would look at wanting the consumers to spend, and that would mean that in order to get them to the pre-COVID-19 levels in terms of the economy, the government would look at introducing a lot of new schemes, incentives, and maybe a relaxation in taxation. But over a point in time, the tax will still need to be increased because the government will need to recoup the tax side of the things in order to pay for these expenditure which they are looking at currently doing or having to do because of sustaining or keeping unemployment low, and obviously making sure that individuals are able to go through this lean period when people are not able to work and obviously lose jobs. So here, essentially, regulation which is going to be covered, which affects taxation side of things, whether it's VAT, whether it's personal tax, whether it's income tax, indirect taxes, when you see them happening in different countries, those are the bits that are covered in the political factors. Now, when we talk about economic factors, here we are talking about things which are going to be related when we talk about country-to-country trade. Not looking at individual organization, but when you're exporting, importing, when you're doing trade which is across the boundary in terms of, looking at companies which are based in the UK or elsewhere, and they are exporting and importing and doing trade with other countries. So in those cases, the factors which could affect the workings of, the organization would be related to things like the exchange rate, interest rates. If there is a fluctuation in the dollar to pound exchange rate, what you would generally see is that the imports become cheaper. But if the pound starts to lose value against the dollar, in some cases you would see the imports become dearer, and those are the economic, let's say, prospects or factors which could affect the workings of a business. One of the things that we saw, the blockage of the Suez Canal, which happened because one of the ships currently, had this issue of, blocking because of, whatever reason was that. You saw billions and pounds of worth of trade was halted between different countries. So one of the estimates on the newspaper was, which I looked at on Financial Times, was that every day about 96 billion pounds worth of, let's say, goods were held up because of the blockage caused by this ship, which ran aground in the Suez Canal. And that backlog has only been cleared yesterday. So when you look at that kind of an impact, which is primarily going to be having an impact with regards to, affecting countries in terms of supplies, in terms of, looking at demand, in terms of looking at, let's say, factors which could be primarily impeding the sale of goods and services, could all be related to economic, factors. When we talk about social factors here, we are looking at generally talking about, changes in the lifestyle, attitude, or, preferences of consumers. So when you look at social and cultural factors, we are talking majorly related to changes in lifestyle, changes related to the taste, and the shifting demographics of the population. So an example that I've given here is that when I look at population in Western Europe, as the population in Western Europe is living longer, birth rates are falling. This is leading to an aging population, which has also happened in Japan, which is also going to happen in China in the next 20 years. It is also going to happen in the US. What we will see is that there will be an obvious impact of such type of, changes which are happening in the demographics of the population, and that would mean that the lifestyle changes which the population will face would also have an effect on the demand of products and services which would be required to be sold in those countries. And this is where the countries or the economies will need to adjust. And these patterns which the companies will need to, which large companies, like Nestle, Unilever, you talk about Procter and Gamble, a lot of these large corporations which basically deal with consumers and provide a lot of different products, as we call them as fast-moving consumer good companies. They would essentially invest and study, put a lot of effort and do the study of these kind of factors in detail, is because there the product lines get affected over a period of time. So here, the changes in demographics of the population obviously would have an impact on the types of products and services which these large businesses would need to sell in some of the geographies because of the changing, lifestyle and, longevity of the population. So these are all factors which typically are considered as social factors. So when we talk about things like what is the current trend, what are the emerging trends. So in some countries, when you look at where there is growing middle class, you look at countries in which there is a younger population. In those countries, the companies have to adopt a different strategy because of the lifestyle preferences and the choice preferences which the consumer has, than with Western countries or economies in which there is an aging population. And that is where, these basic questions have to be answered, and they are tending to be what are called the social and cultural factors. Technological factors tend to be, anything related to technology which can affect the business, which could mean that if a company, let's say a competitor, invests into technology, bringing automation in, which allows it to increase its manufacturing or production capability, then other competitors in the market will have to follow suit in order to keep up with, the demand and also the competition. So in this case, if they don't automate or upgrade to automation, which a competitor has done, that would mean that this will give them a disadvantage. And this is where their sales would go down, whereas the competition, which has increased the production capacity through automating or employing more machinery, is able to sell more and would grab more market share from the others in the market. So in these cases, when we look at, there are technological changes which happen. And these are things or factors like, if you look at Microsoft Windows, for example, I'll give you that which everybody is aware of. And I think what we've seen is over the years, when you've used a PC, at some point in time you had Windows 95. After 3 or 4 years, it changed to Windows 98. Then we had 2000. Then we have had Windows 7. Today we are using Windows 10. So when you look at technological factors, what we have seen in this case is that each version of Windows that we have used over the years, which has come after 3, 4, 5, 6 years, whatever the transition time is, that we have had to migrate to a newer system, because the newer system is much more efficient, much more stable, faster, better, and it has capabilities of, say, for example, if I was still using, say, Windows 98 or Windows 7, one of the things which I will find different from Windows 7 and Windows 10 or other versions would be that Windows 10 has a touch capability. So if you install it on a laptop or a PC or a machine which has touch screen, then this particular version of Windows software allows you to be more productive, faster, quicker. And you can see that happening when you go to retail stores. What you generally see is that because of the touchscreen terminals and the checkout terminal stills that we see, most of these stilling or EOS machines, as we call them, have touchscreen systems, and they are much more efficient because of the fact that it allows different interfaces for us to interact. So this is the use of technology in terms of automating things, making it better, and this allows greater integration with some of the other things wherein inventory systems are now automated. Minimum order inventory can be ordered automatically if the stocks go down, and the use of technology like RFID cards, for example, GPS trackers that we get to see on logistics and haulage companies using. They all are technological advantages which allow the status of the product to be tracked from the supplier manufacturer up until to the last point wherein it is finally sold at the retailer's end. So technology is an important factor, and in some cases this can create a cutting edge difference. And again, an example that I would give here is if you look at COVID-19, during the pandemic, a lot of these brick and mortar model retailers, whichever retail stores, grocery stores, have lost out because some of them do not have an online presence. They do not sell online. But if you look at the likes of Amazon and some of the other bigger stores which have invested heavily into the online model, and Amazon in any case is a company which sells everything online. There is nothing, and what they've done is they have had a lot of business during these conditions because consumers were in a lockdown. When you had to order a lot of things, most of the ordering were happening online, and if you see, technology allowed Amazon to take away a lot of business from other retailers, and that is where they have grown tremendously. And that COVID-19 pandemic has been very let's say fruitful or very useful for them because this has allowed technology to be used, and in this case their business is increased. Now, last of the factors that we talk, which are external factors which can affect the company, is environmental factors. Now, environmental factors could be factors which basically would mean that in this case the company is either involved in manufacturing or production. They're extracting raw material from the earth, and in this case, some of the environmental factors which could affect them could be bad weather, for example. It could be things like legislation, wherein in most Western economies, if you see, coal mining is now being closed. So obviously there is a bit of a pressure in terms of rise of energy costs, electricity costs. It is coming from renewable energy where the government is investing quite a lot, and the idea is there to try and reduce global warming. And in some cases, these kind of environmental factors or regulation which the companies have to comply with put a bit of cost strain. That means that it adds prices, or it adds price to the price of product which they are producing because of the fact that they have to comply with these increased legislation. So some companies see working and complying with environmental legislation which the government introduces as contributing towards more costs or increasing the overheads for the company because they have to increasingly spend on complying with that legislation which has been introduced. So when we talk about environmental factors, these factors could be existing legislation. It could be new legislation which is coming out. So in 2025, for example, in Europe, most large retailers, grocery retailers, would have to do packaging on plastic. That means they will have to have no plastic packaging in food. They will have to recycle most of the packaging that they produce and sell to through products to consumers in the store. 75% of the energy requirements in terms of electricity, heating requirements will have to be generated, by the companies themselves. That means they will have to reorient into investing into what is called solar energy or renewable sources of energy, so that some of these stores which work 24 hours consume a lot of energy. They have a very large carbon footprint. And as you know, thousands and hundreds of thousands of customers visit the store every day. So in those cases, there is now a European regulation in place, which would mean that by 2025, all stores will need to, make sure that they have compliance with generating their own electricity through sustainable use of resources. It could be, using environmental, things like generation of power through wind, solar, and then the other bit would be reducing 75% of the material that they send to landfills, and recycling will have to be done within the same stores for packaging or use of plastic that they do. So these kind of environmental factors which will have impact on the workings of the business are generally going to be, so these are generally going to be considered as environmental factors affecting the, organization. So this helps us cover, the details of how do we describe external factors which are impacting different organizations. So here we could look at taking an example of a small business, a small medium business, or a large PLC, and explain and describe some of these factors which affect them and how they affect them. Any questions on this so far?
So far, I don't have any questions.
Okay, that's great. So let's go. Sorry, go on.
Pestle, what are the letters from?
Sorry, you'll have to be a bit more louder. Sorry, I didn't understand.
I'm talking of Pestle. What does it stand for?
Okay, Pestle actually stands for what is called, P stands for political. It's an acronym. It's a word which is currently now an acronym for political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors.
Okay.
So it is a short form. It's a short form for recognizing what are the factors which could affect the business. So each individual word is represented by these factors.
Okay, political, economic, social,
technological, legal, and environmental.
And environment.
Environmental, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Good stuff. So let's look at assessment criteria 2.2. Now that talks about, so in the first criteria, what we did was we described them, which was basically to identify what are the external factors, and we have just covered them by describing each of them individually in a couple of bullet points. In the second part, we need to do analysis. So analysis would mean that here we have to take a specific organization to explain how these factors affect the operations of that business or of that organization. So in order to do analysis, what I've done is I've taken an example of the company Apple, and using Apple as an organization, because it says analyze how external factors impact the activities of a specific organization. So in order to complete this task, we have to choose a specific organization. It could be any organization that you want to pick. It could be an organization in your own location. It could be a small business, large business, big business, whichever one that you want to pick out, but it has to be a specific company. So in our case, what I've done is for the presentation, I've looked at Apple. Everybody is aware of Apple, so I've taken a large corporation which everybody's heard about. There's a lot of information available about Apple in general, and that is where I've taken this as a company to cover how external factors affect the operations of Apple. Now we know that Apple is a large conglomerate. It is one of the most profitable companies in the world, one of the three most, when I say one of the three most biggest or the largest companies in the world in terms of turnover. So when we look at Amazon, Walmart, Apple, they're turning over in excess of $250 billion. So it is one of the large and very successful companies in the world. They are into a lot many products. They sell, they have products in PCs, tablets, phones, lots of consumer-based services like Apple Music, Apple Pay. So they are present in a lot of different industrial sectors, and also have lots of different types of products and services. A company that we can easily identify with because of the use of iPhone or iPad and some of the products that we have seen that are being used by people amongst all different types of generations. Now, what we have to do is, when we say analyze external factors, we have to apply these Pestle. When I say apply Pestle to Apple, which is a specific organization, that would help us cover this particular task. So what I've done is I've listed out in each of these slides some of the factors which are related to Pestle and how they impact Apple's operation, which will help us cover this task. So when I talk about political factors, some of the political factors that we see, that Apple is an American company, but most of its manufacturing happens in China and Taiwan. So if there is if there are if there are raised political tensions between the US and the Chinese government, what you would see is that if there are restrictions, as it was put in the case of Donald Trump when he was president, he put a lot of restrictions on trade in China. China also increased duties on certain American products, and that is where it started to affect the operations of the company. So here, when we talk about political side of things, when legislation changes, when trade wars erupt, you would generally see that the operations of the company would be affected because of the political decision making which is done, and that would mean the operations of Apple, in this case, profitability, business could get affected. And that is where what I've mentioned is the example of political factors. Now, when we talk about economic factors, because most of the cost in terms of what savings which Apple is making in terms of manufacturing of its products is happening because of the use of cheaper labor as compared to the US in China. So when we see, for example, labor costs or factories like Foxconn, Pentron, when they increase and discuss negotiation and get into negotiations with increase in the cost and wages of salaries of workers which are working within these factories, they tend to have an economic impact on Apple because it decreases its profit or its bottom line, because at some stage these factories which employ thousands and thousands of workers for Apple, and they do all the manufacturing, and in order to improve their let's say wage levels, sometimes when these things happen, you would see that this will cause an economic impact in terms of the profitability side of things on Apple. The other thing that you would see is that if the Chinese currency is to inflate, that means if the exchange rate between the Chinese rand and the American dollar increases, you would generally see that the things, in this case, the raw material and the cost in terms of manufacturing will start to become expensive. And this would lead to the rise in prices of some of the products which Apple is manufacturing in China. And that affects, everybody around the world globally. So if you see, in 2007, when Apple introduced the iPhone, it was $299. But today, if you look at the iPhone 12, it starts at about $1,300. So when you look at the costs, why they've gone up, not just because of technology, but also because in terms of, the costs for manufacturing have gone up. The exchange rates have, they keep fluctuating. So depending on whether it's manufacturing in Taiwan, in China, mainland China, you would see that some of these costs will have to be they are dependent on what are called the exchange rates or currency exchange rates. And that is where sometimes you would see if the dollar increases against the currency of Chinese rand, you would see that the prices of the Apple product starts to become expensive in countries like China and Europe, because the dollar strengthening would mean the product manufacturing would require more costs, and that would mean costs going up. Then we look at social factors. Sometimes when you look at embargoes being established, or when you look at consumers changing their demand, lifestyle, their preferences, you would generally see that the product requirement or demand for that product actually goes up and down. Now, one of the things that we look at in particular when we talk about social factors is that Apple as a company, or most companies, are trying to attract younger consumers, because what they want to do is get them hooked onto their product at a younger age, which would mean at some stage that these consumers would become so well entrenched with the Apple ecosystem that it will be difficult for them to look at considering a change or a replacement at a later stage. So what we have seen and what research essentially shows, that there are two different types of systems, Android and Apple, or iOS, and people who are bought into Android do not change to Apple products, and people who are bought into iOS do not change into Android products. So if you have an Apple iPad, you might not have an Apple, you might have an Apple Mac, and in some cases you might have a iPhone. But if you have a Samsung Galaxy, which is based on Android, what you will generally see is that you would have a Samsung Galaxy tab or an Android tablet, and you would probably end up using a Windows PC, because that is where the compatibility tends to be. So when we look at social factors, what we are looking at is the lifestyle, trend, behavior, the attitude of the consumer, and how it basically relates to the company and its company's products. So these factors have to be studied by the marketing department in particular people within the market research, consumer research department, because they are continuously looking at studying preferences, lifestyle preferences or choices which the consumers would like to make. And depending on that, these factors could also affect, the sales of the company. So when I look at social factors, one of the things that you look at is that when clothes companies manufacture and sell clothes in the Middle East, wherein in certain Islamic countries, if you see, the show of skin is not allowed. So typically with women in particular, you would generally see the clothing lines have to be designed slightly differently. When you look at language packs on phones, for example, if the iPhone is sold in, in the Middle East, it's sold in different countries in Europe, Africa, and they have a different national language. The manufacturers would have to look at, having that default language installed on the phone, because that would allow, the product to be localized. And this is one of the social factors which they have to look at because of language, cultural barriers, and, in terms of lifestyle and preferences. So these are all social factors which are classified, which can affect the operations of a company. Technological factors. Apple, for example, had to introduce Apple Pay because Google introduced the, Google Pay system, which allowed consumers to buy products using their mobile phone or smart technologies. And because of the lagging behind in this case, Apple had to introduce Apple Pay in order to have a competing product, and that allowed it to, compete with smartphone payments or payments using, smart devices, which it did not have an offering for. So this is a compulsion on the technological factor side, because this allows Apple to try and meet the demand for what has been introduced by the competitor in the market, and that is generally the technological demand. Then we look at legal factors. These are factors which could be basically related to legislation, as I mentioned earlier. So things like when we look at Apple as operation in so many countries, when they try and bring profits across, repatriate, or, bring profits across from one country or, to other country, you would normally see that taxation side of things tend to be different. Different subsidiaries would have to follow different accounting systems. And in some cases, the legal side of things would also mean the filing of tax, corporation tax, the rate of corporation tax tends to differ. And in those cases, you would see the legal factors come into play. So legislation would also mean employment laws will have to be followed in different countries. Contracts would have to be drawn up, or adherence to legislation would have to be done in different countries in different ways. And they all tend to be what are called legal factors. Environmental factors, I gave you an example earlier, was that Apple discontinued the use of certain products in its iMacs and MacBook Pro, line of products, because they were considered to be environmentally non-friendly. And because of the legislation introduced and the corporate social responsibility that the companies, is trying to follow, what we generally see is that, in this case, it is compliance with the environmental factors which Apple has to do. And in this case, some of its products that it produces now, it comes out with features and, let's say, product lines which basically use or consume less electricity. They are much more efficient, and, they are much more, when they are done away with in terms of disposed or recycled, they do not cause any damage, because most of the usage of components within the product line are something which can be, recycled, and, the earth metals can be extracted before they are disposed away, and that do not cause any harm to the environment. So here, by using the example of Apple, what we have done in this task is analyze the external factors by using Pestle in particular of how it affects the activities of the organization. So any questions on this particular task 2.2?
I think so far so good.
Okay. The next one that we look at is how do we analyze external factors affecting different stakeholders. Now, when we talk about stakeholders means people who are essentially going to have some sort of, let's say some sort of interest within the organization. So when we talk about stakeholders, they tend to be a group or an individual which will have some interest in the company, the organization, and they would either be investors, employees, customers, government, suppliers. They would all tend to have some sort of a vested interest into the organization. So here, in this particular task, what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to understand how do the external factors affect different stakeholders of the organization. And stakeholders of the organization could be classified into, three broad types. We could classify them into internal stakeholders, which are basically going to be employees. We are going to classify them as connected stakeholders, which are going to be shareholders. And then we're going to classify them as external shareholders, which are going to be related to, external environment or people who are going to be outside the company or the organization. So when we talk about internal stakeholders and how they can be affected, we would look at generally people who are working within the organization directly, like staff, employees, workers, contract workers, and they would have, very strong influence on the working of the organization, how the business is run, because they are the ones which are working on some of these tasks and jobs and responsibilities on a day-to-day basis. So when we talk about the external factors and we talk about internal, affecting the stakeholders, when we talk about internal stakeholders, we look at these as employees, as managers, directors, board of directors of the organization. And when we look at how do they get externally affected, one could be that if the competitor raises, say, for example, if you look at two companies, Procter & Gamble and Unilever, two are fierce rivals. They're very similar product lines, and they're, very large, fast-moving consumer good companies which are present in about 190 countries. You look at Pepsi and Coke, they are fierce rivals, and, you would generally see that they are very similar products, and they are very, similar type of consumer when they target in the market. Now, when you look at internal stakeholders, if Pepsi or if one of the companies is to create a pay rise after, for all its employees, then there will be a bit of a pressure on its competitor like Coke as well to also look at matching the pay rise, because otherwise what they will see is that a lot of employees would leave and would go to its rival to work for them because they feel pay conditions, the requirements in terms of, pay package, remuneration, incentives or benefits are much better at Coke. And so in some cases, in that case, what will happen is you would see the internal stakeholders, which are employees, would ask for better pay, work and conditions and job security. If this is not given, then, they might move to competition or switch over jobs and go to another competitor. So when we talk about their requirements and how external factors can affect them, so pay structure, pay scale, incentives, remuneration could be factors which are affecting the organization, because if the competitor is to raise salaries or provide better packages, then the company would also be forced to, match that offer or match that particular requirement, and that would allow, the internal stakeholders. And, this is an example that I've given, which will show how the external factors in terms of rise in compensation or pay package affects the internal stakeholders. Then we look at corrective stakeholders, which could be shareholders, essentially people who own the stake in the company, they own shares, and in those cases, they could be shareholders, customers, suppliers, and even, external large financial institutions which have invested into the organization. So when we talk about corrective shareholders, we are talking about their relationship or contractual relationship with the organization. Here we are talking or taking into account their prime objective, which is how the management of the organization would be to look at fulfilling their needs, their demands, and obviously looking at meeting their needs and demands in order to, meet the overall objective of the organization. So this table here on the screen actually shows you the requirements from an external perspective, which is the shareholders, and an example which is given, like shareholders would want to look at the company being profitable, the company business growing, and what that would mean for them would be dividends, or dividends declared on shares at the end of the year, bonuses which the directors could receive if the company meets the objective and fulfills the target. And in this case, if they've taken out a long-term loan or issued bonds or shares, then for the financial investors, that would mean more return on investment or capital employed and yield of the bonds becoming better, and that would allow the requirements of the external stakeholders, in this case shareholders, be met. Then last but not the least, we look at external shareholders, and these could be government, these could be local authorities, councils, community, which basically would deal with the organization. And their objective primarily is to ensure that the organization is able to meet some of the requirements of the community at large in requirements which are on the compliance side with the environment regulation. And so in some cases, you would look at the government legislation which the companies would need to comply with. And a simple example that I would give you here, when we talk about external stakeholders and we talk about how organizations meet their requirement, would be that if in the UK, in certain countries, if in the US, UK, some of the Western countries, developed economies, you look at, there is a minimum wage that has to be given for the number of hours the individual works within an organization. Now, this is an external requirement which a company needs to fulfill. So in the UK, the minimum wage for individual working between 16 to 19 is, I think, £4.20. You look at 19 to 24, it's about £6.79. And if you look at anybody who's over the age of 24, the minimum wage per hour is £8.91. So when you look at this as a minimum requirement of wage which has to be paid under the Minimum Wage Act, is an external requirement and is something which is to be dealt with external stakeholders, which are people who work for the organization, meeting the government legislation. And that would mean that the organization would then need to have this minimum requirement in place to be able to meet some of the stakeholder requirements when it deals or sells its products and services in the market. So this allows us to understand that when we talk about stakeholders, other stakeholders, they could be customers, suppliers, employees, government, banks, communities, which are going to be classified as stakeholders. What are the external factors which could affect their own interest is what we've covered with the use of these tables by taking up an example, and that helps us do the analysis of external factors that affect the organizational stakeholders. And an example that I've given in the last slide here is to give you an area of conflict. For example, if employees versus managers, what we generally see is that if employees say that we don't get paid enough, whether vis-a-vis the managers which get paid more, then in this case, job versus wages versus bonus, is something that an accountant would need to look at, that how much of the costs companies are actually spending or an organization is spending into salary, wages, and bonus and incentives. And this is a calculation which an accountant would generally end up doing in order to provide, decision making which can be done at the sector level. When you look at customers versus shareholders, so here what you're going to be looking at is product quality versus service levels versus profit versus dividend. So when I look at customers' requirement, they are interested in better quality products, they're interested in better service levels, and in some cases what you will generally see is that customers would want lesser price for a better quality product and higher service levels. If I look at shareholders, their interest would be primarily looking at what are the profits and dividends that we get at the end of the year, because they've invested significant amount of money either in buying shares or as capital within the business. When I talk about general members of public versus shareholders, general members of public would be more worried or concerned about environmental, reasons of the business doing well versus profit and dividends, because general public is more interested in ensuring that the business are not polluting the environment, or if the factory is set up in a residential area, it does not produce sound, or if there is production of sound, and noise levels have to be reduced, then that would be the more important concern which a general public would have, as against whether the company is making profit or not does not matter to them. So any questions on this, on the assessment criteria 2.3?
So far, no. I think I understand.
Okay, that's great.
Because I covered it in another topic some time back when I was doing business economics. Most of the
Yeah, that's correct, yes. Now, the next one is the assessment criteria. So here we have to use a practical example of how external factors can actually affect a specific organization. So what I've done here is I've just drawn up a small table, but essentially what I would suggest in order to do this task, so in order to do assessment, what you'll have to do is you have to take a specific organization, and with the specific organization apply the Pestle to it to complete assessment. So if you look at this particular task, and if I look at completing this to say, what are the external factors which could affect an organization? So I would, in this case, draw up a table. So I might do a table. So a table would be something in this format. If I look at drawing up a table, so let's look at a table like this. So I will draw up a table like this, and I will basically put, say, for example, if I take an organization like Primark, which is again an ABG group company, which is primarily into clothes, just to give you one example. And in this table, what I will do is talk about political, then talk about, economic, then I talk about social, technological, legal, and environmental. So what I'm going to do is essentially talk about these factors which will allow me to do assessment, as far as the company is concerned. That is what I have to do by using a table and apply Pestle to a particular, company, for example, and that would allow me to cover this particular task. So example, Primark, you could take up a small business. It could be a small business, how it is affected by, say, Brexit. You could take up a business in your own location, wherein you would be able to explain some of the factors like political, economic, social, technological, and that would help us complete this task, because it's all about assessment, which means you have to practically explain by taking an example of a specific organization and apply the Pestle in order to cover this task. And in the distinction criteria, we need to specifically look at how external processes or external factors affect the accounting processes within an organization. Now, this is specific to what we are actually studying. This task is very specific because you need to relate it to how external factors, which is political, economical, technological, legal, or environmental, have an effect on the accounting practices or the accounting process within a particular organization. Now, here, because it talks about evaluation, what we need to be able to do is develop a lot of arguments first and put those across to say why this is an important, why there is a need for us to study the effect of external factors on the accounting practices within a firm. So here are some of the factors which I've taken to build arguments. One is globalization. Now, as companies increasingly become global, their operations go into many, many countries, they have to comply with a lot of different legislation in those countries. And this legislation could be very, very top level. The legislation could mean corporate taxation. It could mean, so one could be taxation. Second could be related to employment laws or the, hiring of labor or people within that country. It could be also related to the adherence to legislation which is required, like in terms of registration of the company, subsidiary operations, foreign direct investment, those kind of things. So all this is covered under globalization. One of the major factors which affects a company when a company decides to start operation in another location. So if a company in the UK decides to launch operations, say for example in Ghana, it will need to look at a lot many things. One, need to look at what are the various requirements for a company to be registered, what are the corporate side of things in terms of legal requirements, then looking at, taxation side of things, then looking at labor laws side of things, then looking at how much of foreign direct investment it can do in the subsidiary, whether the subsidiary can be owned, because in some countries, some locations, some countries do not allow more than 49% in ownership, so that the local subsidiary has more ownership of the company, and that complies with most of the legislation in that geography. So you would see that globalization and technological developments would be more, let's say there are lots of factors, but these are going to be two more important factors, external, which are going to affect the accounting practices or techniques which the company needs to employ to work within a geography. So one of the things that we look at in terms of external impact on how organizations have to shape up their accounting practices would happen because of globalization and would happen because of the implementation of technology. Now, when I say technological, what I mean is that sometimes it's easier to set up a software to be able to comply with all the different accounting side of regulation in a country than to look at employing accountants and having a department. Yes, the people will still be required, but sometimes technological development or advancement will allow the company to quickly meet all the accounting side of laws, because there is a software package available which will have all the implementations of the law and legislation applied when the company employs that particular software package. So if you look at Sage, I don't know, have you heard about Sage? Yeah. So if you've heard about Sage, and if I show you now, if a company or a business decides to open up an operation, you can see that Sage is approved for by so many governments. So it can work in United Kingdom, Ireland, Germany, Spain, France, UAE, Malaysia, Africa, South Africa, Portugal. You look at United States, Canada, and Australia. So it's an organization wherein if a company starts to look at running a business, starting a business, they could look at employing a package like Sage. In large companies, it could be SAP or Enterprise Resource Planning package, which could be specific to accounting. And that package would allow it to meet all the regulations which are set when they do financial side of transactions. And this could be enabled with the use of what is called, technology. So when we talk about external factors affecting the organization from an accounting perspective, we're going to be looking at globalization and we're going to be looking at technology. Now, when we also look at, a lot of studies have been done, and the ACCA, which is, one of the organizations, they also concluded that by 2025, you would see that the big changes which drive, or when I say big changes, that means external factors which drive changes on the accounting processes within the organization would be primarily coming from globalization and technology. And they would include these big changes which are going to happen are going to include, changes in the evolving smart and digital technology. So when you look at most of the products today, when you ship products by DHL, when you go to a retail store, you buy products, you have these RFID cards, tracking of these products which are happening through GPS trackers. You see evolution of smart technologies which is happening, and that allows, when you look at simplest form of it is the barcode. So when in the olden days you used to pick up a product and then somebody would electronically, create a EOS terminal and within that put a product code in. But today barcodes are available which allow you to quickly scan the product. Yeah. So when you look at evolution of technology, you would generally see this being the case. You look at, regulation which is coming in, that would drive some of these changes which are happening on the accounting practices side. Then we also look at, when we look at why do we need to have these, external changes which are going to be required. So these are also required because when you look at accounting information in general and how information is generally presented across the organization. So when you look at information across the organization is normally presented at 3 different levels, right? So these 3 different levels, if I generally put them across in terms of information requirements, you would generally see that the information requirement in the organization tends to be at the operational level, at the management level, and at the planning, which is at the strategy or the board level. Now, when we look at information from that side, Sometimes at the operational level, what will happen is the account people working in accounts and finance would be drawing up ledgers, keeping track of transactions, purchase invoices, expenses, cash flow statements. And their main role would be to look at ensuring that there is enough cash available to run the day-to-day operations of the company. But at the management level, they would then utilize this information through the use of a system which will allow them to do decision making. And this decision making would be used on the basis of financial crunching of information which has been done using a system. And this could be things like if the management is looking at increasing, let's say investing into a new piece of machinery, then they would look at cash flow statements, income and expense statements to look at if there's enough cash flow available for the next few, months and years, and if the capital equipment is being brought on a, part investment and part loan basis, then how much of loan interest costs would be repayable on a monthly basis, and they would look at doing the analysis and then take that decision. At the strategy level or the board level, again, their main aim would be to look at, okay, if this equipment is brought in as a life of 10 years, and this would allow us to increase production or efficiency by so much, and that would allow us to gain this much customers, this much market share, and maybe give us this much rise in profits over a period of 10-year time. So when you look at decision making, which is happening on the basis of accounting related information, this can happen at 3 different levels: operational, management, and strategic level. And for that, you would see today technology allows us to use different systems. So transaction processing systems at the operational level, decision support system at the management level, and then executive information systems at the board or the management level to be able to, allow us to synthesize that information and drill that down into greater detail so that sometimes we are able to, make decisions or long-term decisions quite effectively. And this is one of the reasons why you would see that requirements on the, study of external factors is important from an accounting process point of view within an organization. Now, if I have to quickly relate Pestle to, what could be the accounting side of things, if I have to relate that to Pestle, how would I basically relate it to, let's say, accounting terms or from an accounting perspective? Now, when I talk about political factors, anything in terms of changes to rules and regulations will impact how the accounting is done. Whether it's to do with data protection laws, it is to do with, environmental laws, tax policies, incentives, bonuses, corporation tax, any sort of, competition regulation. That means if a company is trading on, stock exchange, then they'll also be dealing with Securities Exchange Commission or, competition regulation, and that would be, the political factor. Now, if I look at economical factors, how would that affect the accounting trade? This will be the taxes, which could be the, fluctuation in, say, for example, currency or exchange rates, inflation, taxes going up and down, and they would be the having an implication on the accounting side of things when we talk about economic factors. Then when we talk about, social factors, we are looking at, the changes in the trend, lifestyle, preferences, and, for example, so when we look at that, that would be primarily looking at, something called, social factors. So when we talk about social factors here, the idea would be to basically relate to, some of the bits which are related to demographics, lifestyle, attitude, and in general, the habits of the consumer. And when we talk about technological factors, we are looking at, anything which is going to affect, the trading conditions or, for example, productivity, efficiency of the organization by the use of technology. And which is where I've said, things like the new technology which is coming in allows the companies to become more competitive, and this could be an external factor. So if the competition upgrades to a newer version of a machine which allows it to increase production, then as a company, you would need to follow suit, because otherwise you'll start losing market share or consumers in the market because your production is falling or is at the same level, whereas the competition is increased production to be able to sell more in the market. Then we talk about organizational factors, which could also affect, accounting side of processes within the organization. And these could be factors which are broadly, classified into two. And they would be organizational factors, because there are lots of studies which have been done which trigger what is called the changes in the accounting side of things. And these tend to be, what are called the, organizational factors and environmental factors. So these are external, bits in terms of external influences which will affect the organization. And organizational factors tend to be more in terms of if two companies are merging operations, if you're looking at two companies essentially, outsourcing, say, for example, mergers and acquisition, outsourcing, downsizing, decentralizing. These are factors which are going to be related to organizational side of things. When we talk about environmental, we are looking at, competition, let's say the adherence to certain legislation which the government has introduced in a particular geography. This could be related to, when I talk about, say, for example, factors which would affect, companies' operation in different countries because of globalization, advancement in technology. So one such coverage that we did was also in terms of, looking at how, I would say, let's say the requirements in terms of, when I said fuel efficient cars, so you have Euro 6, certain norms which are applicable across certain vehicles for carbon emissions across different countries have to be looked at, and that would be an environmental factor, because at some stage, if you're investing into R&D, that would mean that the company is spending money to make more fuel efficient cars. At some stage, this would conform with the conditions required to meet the environmental legislation in a particular country, and that would mean that the production of those cars could be done much more effectively by the company in those geographies, because it is able to meet that requirement. And how does it affect affect the organization? This from an accounting perspective is because the accounting practices will need to incorporate these changes which are local, which have to be localized, maybe in the software, or in the case of, looking at incorporating them in terms of processes when they deal with vendors, suppliers, if they are doing import and export, duties which have to be applied, and they would all be related to, the accounting side of practices when we talk about these factors. Now, in order to do the evaluation, you might want to take up any of this factor and then relate it to a specific organization. So you don't need to cover all these. I have covered them in a great amount of detail. So I've taken a lot of points essentially to build up these arguments. And these are like financial accounting and regulation governance. So for example, you look at standards like GAAP, which is applied in the US. You look at standards of IFRS, which are applied in other countries. In some cases, accounting practices are different. And in some cases, what the main organizations they do is they try and create standards which then allows companies and their accounts to be equated across various, or presented across various different operations or geographies and countries, and that would allow the financial statements to be standardized. But whichever, standards the companies follow in terms of accounting practices, whether it's GAAP or it's IFRS, they tend to all basically give out the same set of financial information which is required to be provided when companies file accounts at the end of the year, or when they pay corporation tax at the end of the year. So all these factors which can affect the organizational externally are factors which relate to accounting side of things. So which could be financial accounting and regulation and governance. When you look at Brexit as one of the factors which has happened when UK has now exited the EU. So there's a lot of change in legislation which is happening both in terms of, accounting, both in terms of paperwork and documentation to deal with, customs, imports, export. And this is primarily related to, the accounting side of transactions. You look at globalization and you look at environmental factors, you look at technology in general. These are all factors which are affecting the organization and its function from an accounting process point of view, because they have financial implications at the end of the day on the organization. And all these implications which are financial have to be accounted into or have to be incorporated into the accounting side of processes within the organization. And that is where we have to cover this particular task by building some arguments around how, the changes which are happening in the environment, like globalization, you're looking at technological changes, legal changes, legislation changes, or compliance with environmental regulation is then forcing companies to look at incorporating these changes into the accounting processes, and that is then reflected in the final statements which these companies produce, balance sheets, income statements, annual general statements, which they produce at the end of the year, and that is what is required to be covered in this particular task. So any questions on this task? Any questions here? Right. Okay, so with this, what we will do is, complete this particular session. I will get a copy of this presentation uploaded, and also the recording of the session, along with one or two handouts, which is going to be, helping you to study some of the bits that we have covered today, which is primarily external factors and their impact on the organization, on different organization. And this is to look at, Pestle and Pestle analysis in general to be able to cover, this particular learning outcome. So thanks so much for joining, and bye for now. I'll catch up with you next week.